foundational opposition between man and God, and the following sequences of separation: vegetal, animal, flesh, blood, consequent to the initial contract, thou shalt not kill, becomes an entire system of logical oppositions. Different from the Holocaust, this system of biblical abomination presupposes it and guarantees ethical efficiency. Semantically dominated, at least initially, by the like-that dichotomy, it eventually becomes a code of differences and similarities in relation to the Holocaust, but finally replaces it and avoids it. Contrary to certain structurally psychoanalytical schools who see the symbolic law as an absolute, I think that the biblical conception, particularly the prophetic insistence on abomination as a permanent theme in the very election, it's never achieved, we have always to purify ourselves, signals that the strategy of identity is never gained once and for all. And if the symbolic paternal order, speaking being constituted, is certainly absolute, which should be won over by he who is elected by it. So our tendency is now to hastily reduce Freud to Future of an Illusion from 1927 and the strategy of separations and taboo against Holocaust. One of the forces of monotheism. The other one, much more complicated because related to something that is important in the third millennium and that is commonly described as sublimation or perversion even, is the figure of the beaten son, father of Christianity. And I'll try to ask you your attention on this particular figure that will point the importance of the dynamic of love to death in Christianity and how it brings to sublimation and the explosion of art representation in this another force of monotheism that is Christian art. Although paternal connotations of the divine creator in the Bible abound, it is Christianity that actively and perseveringly exploits the paternal axis of the symbolic order. And it does so specifically through the complex relationship between Jesus as man, God, Son of God, on the one hand, and as God the Father himself in the Trinity. Without claiming to offer an exhaustive overview of this complex topology, I would like to propose this evening a possible interpretation alongside a rereading of Totem and Taboo from 1912 and the small article of Freud that you may know, A Child is Beaten from 1919 by Freud. Yet also informed by my clinical observation of the desire for the father, of sadomasochism and sublimation. Remember that for Freud, the murder of the father is a foundational act, a historical reality in human civilization. In a similar way, for Christians, Christ is a historical character, and the murder may be commemorated as a real one. I'll not discuss this historical event and their supposed reality. I am only interested in the psychic reality which generates fantasies in the subject who believes in such events, whether or not they actually occurred. What would happen if Jesus were not only a child or a beaten brother, but a beaten father, beaten to death, Remember that when Freud analyzes the fantasy, a child is beaten. He says that everybody of us has such kind of fantasy. A child is not beaten, is not me, is a boy. And he interprets this by saying that this fantasy is a reaction of the guilt against the incestuous desire of the speaker for the father. I want to have a sexual desire, but I feel guilt and I have the fantasy of being beaten because of this desire. And there are different figures of avoiding being beaten. Me, it's not me, it's under the water. So this is the expression of the guilt about the incest taboo. I want to transgress the incest taboo, and this transgression generates a guilt, and I have to be condemned and beaten, punished because of this transgression of the incest taboo. So, what happens if the beaten person is not a child, not a brother, but a father, because Christ is also God. It's not only some parent like me, some cousin or something like me, but a divine father and father. By combining the son and the father, this scenario has the advantage of appeasing both the incestuous guilt that weighs on the desire for the father, the sovereign father, and of encouraging virile identification, even in the case of women, with the tortured man, but only under the cover of masochism, promoted, even recommended by this double movement. The path is thus paved in the unconscious for the Oedipal family, who is usually the agent of the law and prohibition, to be now able to fuse with the subject of the guilty amorous passion that I am, as a girl or a boy loved by the same father. I will be beaten, but he will be beaten too. Both of us, the father and the son, will succumb to a sadomasochistic passion that underlies love experience. The Superman father is in this situation humanized. He is even feminized by the suffering that he undergoes. And because of this, he is at once my ideal love object and my double, and ego ideal. A sort of complicit us is formed then by and in the Father's passion. From here on, we shall share love, guilt, and punishment together. It follows that for the unconscious, this father-daughter and son reunion suspends the incest taboo in and by the suffering of the two punished lovers. The father is punished and the son is punished. He is punished as God as man, in such a way that this suffering will necessarily be experienced as a marriage, because we shall unify together in suffering. The suffering of the father beaten to death, sexualized under the whip of fate, this love without pity. I'll paraphrase here Baudelaire's verse from Baudelaire, sous le fouet du plaisir, ce bourreau sans merci. You know how Baudelaire was deeply Catholic. Only a Catholic could say this, sous le fouet du plaisir, ce bourreau sans merci. It's the paradise of masochism, but it's also the way of sublimation. So by placing the fantasy of the father beaten to death at the summit of the evangelic narrative, so that it calls out for our identification, Christianity does not content itself with reinforcing prohibition of desires. Paradoxically, it displaces them, it recognizes this sadomasochistic desire, but also it appeases them and paves the way to work through them, to sublimate them, to represent them in dancing, in painting, in music. However, being beaten as the son father is beaten, the subject's unconscious releases his desire from guilt's hold and enables them to make for it what must be called sovereign, divine suffering. This is no longer the